Welcome to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the Second World War from the Allied and Axis perspectives. I'm Jesse Alexander, a public historian specializing in the history of the two world wars.
And I am Matthias Strohn, German officer, professor of military studies, and author. Hello, dear listeners, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of World War II, Both Sides of the Wire. If you watch this as a video, you will see that now for the second time it is just me here. Jesse is not with us, so you have to make do with me another time. I promise you it is going to be the last time for the time being, because Jesse will be back soon, and then we go back to our normal routine. Today, you might say hijacking this particular episode for a very particular reason, because behind our paywall, where we communicate, interact with our members, we ask these members what topics they would find interesting, they would like us to discuss, they would like us to shed some light on. And amongst others, one of them was the secret German rearmament after the First World War in the interwar period. And I thought, well, you know what, this is a topic for me, because my PhD was on the German army in the interwar period. And of course, the secret and then later on open rearmament played a very, very important role. So I thought, well, I know one or two things about this. I can probably bore the audience to death with this. This is, again, where you have to be careful what you wish for. You might get another 10 episodes on this. I promise you it won't be that bad. I am going to keep it hopefully reasonably short, and as always, logical and easy to follow. Before I go into this, just a completely different point. I was going through lots of these comments that you have all left, and I could see that you all picked up on, not all, but some of you picked up on a mistake I made somewhere. I can't remember which episode it is, but a few of you pointed out that I called Germany a landlocked country in one of our episodes. I think we can all agree that that is nonsense. I'm not even quite sure why I said it. I'm just thinking the context behind that being what I meant was Germany as a continental power, where from a military point of view, the army has always been the most important service, followed by, you might probably argue, the Air Force, mainly because it's there to support the army in its endeavors. And then you've got the Navy following suit. So my apologies. Please, if you do pick up any of these mistakes that I make, because sometimes they happen when you're just talking and you're talking away and you get all excited about a tangent that we always find. These things can happen. Please point them out, leave a nice comment, and we just say, oh, I think you might have got it wrong. Am I right in thinking this? Can we talk about this? Whatever you want to say in a nice way, and then we can set the world right, I would say. Maybe that's enough on that. So let's have a look at German rearmament in the 1920s and 1930s. I think most people, when they look at this, when they're interested in this topic, they would concentrate very much on the rearmament that happens in the second half of the 1930s, because this is where the Reichswehr is turned into the Wehrmacht, and this is then, of course, enlarged, and that gives you the army that then goes to war in 1939. But really, this is just the end point of a rather lengthy development, a development that starts, you might say, right at the end of the First World War. And of course, if Jesse were here now, I'd say, well, as always, well, what a big topic. Where do we start? What is the context that we need to talk about? And maybe if I take it back to the end of the First World War and start with this, then hopefully this will set us up quite nicely for the stuff that happens then during the rest of the interwar period. So if we go to the end of the First World War, as we probably all know, the November 1918, the war comes to an end. This is just basically, it's an armistice, it's the ceasefire. It does not mean that the war is over. And there are a number of people who in the Allied camp fear that the Germans might take up arms again. And there are also in the German camp, people say, well, that's exactly what they should do. So withdraw to the River Rhine, build up a defensive position there, and then hold the Allies for how long? Of course, very illusionary, because the army has collapsed, the country is in turmoil, there is revolution, but there's some people who are still thinking this. And it's interesting when you look at the spread of these people. Most of them who say that they should continue to fight are the people from Prussia, mainly from the East Elbe, so east of the River Elbe territory, whereas people from the western part of Germany say, no, this is all nonsense, we need to surrender. The most prominent person in this camp is probably Gröner, who is the head of the last OHL. So he's from Württemberg, from the southwest, and says, no, we can't take up arms again. Interesting that the other guys say, no, this is exactly what we need to do. We make a last stand, and even if it's just for the national honor, that's the most important thing. And they always link it back to 1806, so the defeat of Prussia by Napoleon. You can see, listen, I'm getting quite close to Frederick the Great here. Unfortunately, I'm not touching him. He dies 20 years before the Prussian army is then defeated in 1806. But you can see there's an interesting frame of reference here. And there are a number of meetings. One of them, for example, held in Kolberg with the senior leadership of the army at that particular stage, where they discuss these things. And they say, okay, where do we get the people from? Where do we get the soldiers from? And they say, well, in theory, at this stage, it's still very, very easy because the war's just over. You've got all these people, either still in uniform or just gone home. Most of them actually have taken their rifles with them, or a lot of them. So you can say, if we could mobilize these guys again, here we've got an army, so we can fight. Very quickly, they then realize, well, it's a great idea. It is illusionary because these people will no longer fight. That's why you had a revolution. And basically, the whole thing comes to naught. However, it already sets the scene a little bit for the thinking about rearming, going back to a military conflict over the next few years. And one of this is the manpower pool. And it's interesting to see that the army says that for about 10 years after the end of the war, there is still a reasonably good pool of manpower. So these people who'd fought in the First World War. But then, of course, they get older. They've forgotten their training. They've forgotten their experiences. And from you might say the last few years of the 1920s onwards, they say, okay, no, these guys are no longer usable. We need to do something else. And just perhaps keep that in the back of your mind as we go through the years now, because it has an impact on what the Germans think they can do and what they can achieve. I think the next big event then, of course, is the Versailles Treaty. We have talked about the Versailles Treaty a number of times. It always keeps popping up because it's one of these cornerstones of the history in Europe, particularly, of course, Germany in the 20s and 30s, leading up to Hitler and to World War II. And when we look at what goes on here from a pure military perspective and how question of rearming or having an army or military of strength, there is not a lot there. I'm going to repeat very, very briefly what we dealt with in other podcasts. I think one of the very first ones, I think when we talked about the myths, we also talked about the Versailles Treaty. To cut a very long story short, well, the Navy is reduced to 15,000 men, no great ships, no submarines, none of that sort. And the army is also reduced. The army is reduced to 100,000 men. There's supposed to be no air force at all, no planes. And the army does not have any modern equipment. So it's organized in 10 divisions, 7 infantry and 3 cavalry divisions. And these don't have any modern equipment. The entire artillery of the German army, as prescripted, given to you in the Versailles Treaty, is 84 guns of 10.5 centimeter caliber. This is nothing by the standards of the 1920s. So or 1919, actually, when the treaty is signed, just coming out of the First World War. The same applies to the manpower, 100,000 men. Quite a few Western armies these days will say, ooh, wouldn't that be brilliant, 100,000 men, if only we had them. In the context of the time, 100,000 men is a very, very small force, particularly if it doesn't have the material to go with it. So basically, it's a paramilitary police force, not more than that. When you look at the countries that surround Germany that might be perhaps potential allies, and that's how the German military sees that at the time, you're looking at, roughly speaking, about 350 to 400,000 Czech soldiers. You're looking at somewhere in the region of around about 500,000 Polish soldiers, roughly speaking. And you're looking at a standing army, even after demobilization in the French camp, of around, roughly speaking, 800,000 in 1919, even more. Particularly French, of course, with modern equipment, and the Germans don't have anything to match this. So you can already see there is not anything that Germans can really do should another war break out. And yet it's interesting when you look at the accounts, when you go to the archives and you look at the documents, the stuff that has been produced at that particular time in the German camp is, perhaps you might say, more optimistic than you might expect in a situation like this. Germany's just lost a world war. The army is basically no longer there. The soldiers have to serve for long years. So the soldiers themselves, so other ranks, for a minimum of 12 years, officers for 25 years. The idea being that you can't build up a strong reserve force by quickly moving troops through. No equipment. So there isn't anything there. And yet, when you look at the early war games, for example, that the army holds, and some of these writings and debates, they're cautiously optimistic, you might even say, that if a war breaks out, they might be able to, well, perhaps not even win, but at least perhaps be able to survive. I think there are a number of reasons for that. And some of them are perhaps even military. I think most of them, to be perfectly honest, are just being unable to accept reality and what's just happened. So the officer corps so gobsmacked by what's just happened that they simply can't accept reality. I think that's probably the most important point. There are some other arguments and points where you might say, okay, this is why they think it's the case. Of course, they look to the other countries. You might say the other nations are a bit war-weary. Should a war break out in 1919, 1920, would, for example, the Americans get involved? They picked up some feelers from the British that they wouldn't be able, yes, but not really interested. So you can see there's a little bit of that. It's still, of course, absolutely illusionary that the German army would stand a chance. You have this idea of, well, still having the troops in Germany that can mobilize, but all that, I think, it doesn't really work. And then when you look on top of that, what the Allies are also doing, they have a commission. It's the Inter-Allied Military Control Commission, it's called, which goes around Germany to make sure that Germany, in particular, of course, in this case, the German military, complies with the Treaty of Versailles. So you could constantly kind of French people and British officers and Americans and others were kind of poking their noses into business that, as the Germans would say, isn't theirs to poke their noses into. But obviously, you know why they're doing it. They abolished the general staff. That in itself is quite an interesting one because that's seen as the, you might say, the kernel of Prussian German military efficiency. So the German general staff system is seen as this. Well, this is the epitome of good military leadership and staff work or what have you. So they say that needs to go. It's interesting because the Germans are quite clever at all sorts of level to just outmaneuver the Allies. And they, yes, okay, we're going to get rid of the general staff. We understand this. So basically, they keep the organization with a number of changes and they just rename it. And it's now called the Truppenamt, the troops office. The structure in there is exactly the same as beforehand. The people, to a large degree, are the same. So sometimes you wonder how they were able to fool the Allied Control Commission, or whether some of them actually turned a bit of a blind eye. So all of these things, these things coming together. And another reason why, at least to begin with, the German army is perhaps cautiously, you might say, optimistic that they might be able to at least survive a war is of course, first of all, the military experience. They say as individual soldiers, the German soldier is superior to the enemy. Well, of course, the problem is you've just seen that you've been defeated. So how does that wash? And then there is another thing, and that's quite interesting. And here's, again, I'm going off a bit of a tangent, so please bear with me. Some of you have said in the comments that you like the tangent, so here's one for you. We need to understand at this stage, the guy at the very top of the German army. It's all very army-driven. I mean, there are a number of reasons for that. First of all, as you might know by now, I'm an army person, so I understand more about the army than the Air Force, in particular the Navy. And as I said earlier in my short explanation, not landlocked, but a continental power, the army is always more important. And in this whole debate, it is interesting, even at that particular time, everyone and everything is fully concentrating on the army. The Navy is just there, but no one really deals with this. I mean, there are one or two exceptions. So, for example, I can just bring this in here, and then I can leave the Navy behind, so to speak. Navy people, please forgive me. So, when the Germans are looking at how to kind of build up a strong Navy, or at least gain some experience in modern naval warfare, even though they're not allowed to have any modern equipment, no U-boats, no modern battleships, for example. What they do is the German companies, supported and funded by the German government, i.e. the Ministry of Defense, works together very, very closely with companies in the Netherlands. And basically, cut quite a long story short, they're building U-boats there in the 1920s and the 1930s. So you can see there's a bit of that going on as well. In the great scheme of things, not an awful lot, because it is quite difficult to hide away a modern battleship should you want to build one. There's a big battleship debate in Germany, but it's not really to do with the rearmament or with the Allies and restriction. It's more they're allowed to have a small. It's not even a battleship. It's probably more of a cruiser. They're allowed to have this. There's an internal debate because they're expensive. Do you want to build this or increase social spending? That is a debate that probably sounds quite familiar. That was the first tangent within a tangent, I would say. I'm probably already beginning to confuse you. But if we go back to the first tangent that I wanted to mention, and that is linked to the head of the army at that particular stage. So that chap, he is called Hans von Seeckt. And Hans von Seeckt is an absolutely fascinating character. He is a system of the old Prussian military system. However, his views are quite different from those of most other people. And there's a reason for that. And the reason is that during the First World War, he spends most of his time not fighting on the Western Front. There's a very short stint in 1914 where he takes part in the advance into France. From there, he is then moved to the Eastern Front, and he becomes the chief of staff of an Austrian army, later on a German army as well. And he is basically one of the composers, you might say, one of the people who put together the great offensive in 1915 at Gorlice-Tana, one of the most exciting operational breakthroughs of the war. From there, he's then sent to the Ottoman Empire, i.e. modern-day Turkey, and a bit more, and he becomes chief of staff of that particular army. So his experience is not trenches. It's not the First World War as we imagine it. It's war of movement, of mobility. And what he's also seen, both on the Eastern Front and also in the Ottoman Empire, is that small armies, if they are better equipped, more mobile, better trained, better led, can outmaneuver, can defeat larger armies. And that is really interesting because when you look at what he writes about future armies, it's a little bit like, you might say, what we find in lots of Western armies today. So he says, I don't want conscription anymore. I want a professional army. Bit of debate, about 200,000 men, he says, that can be sent into war immediately war is declared. No need for mobilization. We send them in immediately. They need to have the best equipment, the best training, and all of these things, and they can win the war. Big debate after he's gone in 1926. Before that, no one dares to question him. As always, good military tradition and approach. And then, of course, you have this big debate between him, let's call it a modernist if you want, and the more traditionalist who said, no, it's all about big armies, it's about conscription. And when you jump forward, of course, well, these guys then win the argument. But there's a lot of very interesting thinking in Hans von Seeckt's ideas and theory about modern warfare. And he says, well, the tyranny of the masses, as he calls it, well, these days are over. We've seen the First World War. I don't want this. I need an army that is, extremely well trained. It's professional and can be sent into battle immediately. Because they've got this, well, except for the equipment, because they can't have it, but they've got, you might say, the right sort of mindset. This then makes it easier later on to expand and enlarge the military, particularly the army. Out of that then follows the Air Force as well. So you can see how it's all linked. And because he doesn't believe in big armies anyway, he said, well, you know what, okay, they might have all these huge conscript armies, the French and the Poles and all these other countries that might want to destroy or invade Germany or whatever. But he said, okay, well, let's see what happens. I'm not overly worried. And as I said, we look at the war games, they're actually reasonably optimistic for the Germans. So it's not as Seeckt writes in one of his internal papers that he sees the German army marching on to Paris on day 3 of the mobilization. Again, that's a bit illusionary. But in the war games, they normally war games at that particular time are quite honest and brutal. When you look at the paperwork, if someone does something silly, that gets mentioned and said, no, you would have lost this battle. That doesn't happen. So we say, okay, that looks good. Then something happens. And this then is another event which is absolutely fundamental to understand what goes on in the German military at that particular time. It's an aspect that hasn't been forgotten about, but I don't think really gets the attention that it deserves, and that is the occupation of the Ruhr area in 1923. What happens? So the Germans in the Treaty of Versailles say that they're going to pay reparations, all sorts of stuff. One of the parts and contingents is wooden poles. So basically, they're telephone poles and masts. The Belgians and the French, who both think that the Versailles Treaty should have been slightly harsher. Again, there's a discussion in the Allied camp about the whole thing, where they keep a very, very close watch over the Germans supplying and handing over these goods from their operations. In late 1922, the Germans fall behind, and they're short about 100,000 of these telegraph poles and telephone masts. This is taken as the reason, excuse, whatever you want to call it, for French and Belgian forces to march into the Rhineland in the west of Germany and occupy the industrial heartland of Germany. It has all sorts of implications. One of them is the hyperinflation of 1923, because the government tells everyone to stay at home, go on to passive strike, so don't work anymore, but the government continues to pay the workers. Industrial production is not zero. You've got other industrial areas as well, but it's the industrial heartland, so it drops. And basically, after about, roughly speaking, 8 months, Germany is completely bankrupt, and you've got the first hyperinflation, followed, of course, then by another one in the early 30s, which you might argue is a main contributing factor to bringing Hitler to power. So 1923, that also happens. They then decide that they have to cancel this by the end of 1923. In early 1924, they come up with some sort of solution, which means that all sides can get out of the situation relatively unharmed. No one's losing face. So that's quite important, because the Brits and also the Americans say, well, you French and Belgians, well, you shouldn't really do this because it's bad for our economy as well. So that's the economic factor. That in itself is probably relatively well known if you're interested in this particular period and area. And also the rise of the Nazi Party. 23 is also, of course, the year of the Hitler's beer hall putsch. So you can see all of these things coming together, even though they're not necessarily related. But from a pure military point of view, the occupation itself, so the first step of all this, is very, very important as well. Because this really opens the eyes to the German military that there's nothing that they can do. So Seeckt actually writes an article, so it's on the cover page of the Militärwochenblatt, which is the main weekly in those days, and he basically says, well, our hand reaches to one side where the sword used to be. It only grabs thin air. There's nothing left. We are defenseless. And it is really interesting when you look at the documents in the archives that this really seems to be the watershed moment for the German military. This is where they all realize, okay, there's nothing we can do. The French and the Belgians can just march into Germany, and there's nothing that we can do. They're looking at mobilizing some sort of militias. They had formed some militias in the aftermath of the First World War. There are different ones. Probably the most famous one is the Freikorps, the Free Corps. So these are ex-military personnel who, once war is over in 1918, 1919, don't really want to go home, and they form new units and formations, normally around a charismatic military leader. For example, Marine Brigade Erhard. Erhard was he was a naval guy, a captain, and he forms this and then fights against all sorts of communists, socialists, or whoever they thought these people were. So it's a very strong movement. It is strong in these early stages after the end of the war. So you might say really into 1919, 1920. There are a number of uprisings in Germany. You've got the Spartacus uprising in Berlin, 1919, which is defeated by the Freikorps. You've got an uprising in the Ruhr area pretty much at the same time, which is also defeated. And then you also have these units being used, you might say, nearly enough as regular military forces. The most famous incident here is the fighting at the Annaberg, which is Upper Silesia, where they fight against Polish troops and Polish groups who've occupied some territories of Germany. This in itself is a very complex story. I don't want to get down into the weeds because that will take us forever, the whole thing about plebiscites, what have you. So I keep this very, very, very general. And there's also the government. They actually use these guys. So you've got the defense minister at the time. It's a chap called Noske. He is a socialist. And he, after the collapse of the empire, and the Kaiser is gone and all this, and the old government is gone, you've got the new government in, and then okay, we need a defense minister. So who are we going to take for this now? And no one really wants the job because it's a socialist government. They're not on good terms with the military. and you already kind of know that you probably have to make some sort of deals with the military if you want to keep the population quiet, including using the free corps, which really goes against everything the socialist stands for. And in the end, it's Noske who's chosen. And when he then uses the free corps, he says, one of us has to be the bloodhound, he says. And that basically, with that, he unleashes these free corps to shatter the communist uprising. So all of that in itself is fascinating, really, really, really interesting history from a social point and social aspect as well. When you fast forward and you look, for example, at a lot of later leaders of the National Socialist regime and also a lot of the leading military people, a lot of them had actually served in the Free Corps in the early 1920s. In 1921, Sieg then says, okay, we're going to do away with these guys, so let's ban them because they became uncontrollable. It's a little bit not the same level, but the idea a little bit the same. So there's the problem with the SA, the Sturmabteilung, so the Nazi in-house army, so to speak, which of course became stronger and stronger, uncontrollable. You've got a little something similar here. It's smaller scale, but it's kind of the same idea. You then have other militias, local militias that were being formed. In particular, you also have the Grenzschutz, so that's the border guard, which was set up at that time. I've got Border Guard West and Border Guard East. The man who writes about this and is one of the driving people behind this is a chap called Hiel. He later on becomes the head of the Reichsarbeitsdienst in the Nazi period. So again, you can see all sorts of interesting links there. That organization is set up, but everybody realizes quite quickly, you know what, these guys are, they're a militia. They're not very good. We can use them, but it would just be, it's just like, not even like light infantry. They would not be able to stop anybody. When the Allies get wind of this, particularly in the West, the Germans actually decide to disband them because of the military value is not worth the hassle and the tension that we would get if we kept them. Different on the east, in the eastern side, the potential Eastern Front, where they keep them all the way through. You have a small contingent, which is called the Feldjäger. You might say, again, it's quite a complex topic. This is a little bit like partisans. So they were being trained. They had their secret weapon depots. If the enemy invades, well, they should roll over by the enemy, so the enemy marches through, and then you basically rise up and attack the rear area. Again, they make a lot of it, but when you look at the actual numbers, the actual figures, not one area that they had created actually gets to the numbers that they thought they needed to. So again, it's a bit of a castle in the sky, the whole thing. So not an awful lot happening in that particular area. You also then have what they call the Black Reichswehr, so the Schwarze Reichswehr. Reichswehr is the term of the German armed forces from 1919 all the way to 1935 officially, so 2 years into the time Hitler's taken over. And these guys are, again, it's you might say it's a bit of a paramilitary force. You've got these people who are still trained. They get their secret weapon stashes. If something happens, well, basically you get these out and you start fighting. Again, very difficult to control. I think the Allies in particular make too much of it. Sometimes in the literature, we also make too much of it. Because again, when you look at the actual sources, the numbers were reasonably low. The weapons that they have, yes, they've got some, but how many weapons, how many guns can you actually hide in order to equip an entire army? You can't. So again, it's not overly impressive. And these are also then banned after a while, and there's to do also with a particular episode. So you have an attempted putsch in Prussia, and that's particularly in the area of Küstrin, the big fortress of the Küstrin uprising. A number of the Black Reichswehr people are involved in this, and when this is basically nipped in the bud, they then decide that we get rid of the Black Reichswehr, and that is basically the end of the story as well. So you can see that there's a little bit of you might say of grey area of we're not quite sure what we're doing. We're using all the different formations that we can use, but in the end, that doesn't really work, and people realize this. And Sieg is also very clear. He says, well, all these groups, they're a bit useless. They're not really within a military system. I don't really trust them. Can we please get rid of them? And so this is basically what they do. And so they then look at the situation after the occupation of the Ruhr, as already said, and that's the problem. So how are we going to deal with it? And it's really interesting when you look at what they do then. So first of all, when you look at the war games, the character of the war games changes. So how you get all these officers together, they get around a table, or sometimes actually go out into the open field and look at how armies would fight. And from 1923 onwards, it's pretty obvious that all the way into the 1930s, actually quite to the late 1930s, the characters changed, and they're now looking very much at defensive warfare. I could talk now through all of the different war games. I've still got the folders there. It's about 2.5 meters of printed paper just on war games that I've still got in my office. I'm not going to bore you. Suffices to say, so the idea most of the time that they have is they're fighting either 2 or 1 front war against definitely the invading French, probably against the Poles as well, potentially also against Czechoslovakia. And again, I'm oversimplifying a little bit. The idea is, where does the army stand, fight, and die? Which is the defensive line and barrier? Because they realize that they are actually far too weak and they can't do anything. So this is the problem. Is there a solution to this? Well, not really at that particular point, because you're still restricted by the political realities of that particular time. However, there are some areas where you can have an impact. And again, we need to rewind and look at the political situation in the 1920s. So Germany's lost the war. Germany is kind of a pariah. It's not part of the League of Nations, so they're not invited. There is another country that also falls into that category, and that is the newly founded Soviet Union. So these are, you might say, the 2 pariahs of Europe. And that, of course, means these 2 pariahs get together. They sign a treaty, the Treaty of Rapallo. It's mainly about economic stuff, but as a consequence of this and some secret negotiations that take place, there is now an increased military cooperation between Germany and the Soviet Union. That is probably, I would argue, the most famous aspect of the early rearmament and secret rearmament that you find in Germany. Should you have seen the series Babylon Berlin, which is very famous now these days, at least everyone in Germany's seen it, say that this whole thing about this detective in Berlin in the 1920s and then later on in the 1930s. There are a couple of episodes that deal with exactly that, the secret rearmament, and he then flies to Russia, takes pictures. I mean, that's artistic license and freedom, but you get the idea, the underlying idea behind this. So what is it that you actually do? So basically, the Germans talking to the Soviets, because they're not allowed to have any modern equipment, they still try to keep the intellectual flame alive, the conceptual component of fighting power. But apart from that, there's nothing they can do. They can't have a big tank force. So what they do is they go to the Soviets and say, okay, let's make a deal. So the idea is that we're going to develop a number of tanks. We're going to send them to the Soviet Union. We're going to test them there. And all we kind of basically share the know-how. That's the idea. And because the Germans are not allowed to have a big tank force, so this is why they disguise them, give them different names, basically call them tractors, Tractor 1 and Tractor 2. The first one, ship them over there, and that's how it works. Should you be interested in this, go onto the website of Rheinmetall, the big arms manufacturer. I did this again when I was refreshing my mind about a few things. There's actually quite a long paragraph about Rheinmetall's involvement, because that was the industry side of that particular deal, you might say. This particular one, so the tank school at Kama, operates really from 1929 to 1933. Of course, they built these things a little bit earlier, but this is when it's really, really operational. And for example, one thing that falls out of it is the design of the Panzer 1 and other things. So there we are. Perhaps the most important thing that falls out of this one is, of course, again, is the conceptual component. So how do you actually use tanks? What is it that you do? And you can look at the number of people who were being trained. So these guys, for example, include Ernst Volkheim, who then became a very, very influential thinker in German tank warfare. Blomberg was there, I think. I think Model was there. There is a debate about whether Guderian was there or they just went to visit. So you can see a number of famous people. I think Thoma was there as well, Ritter von Thoma. So quite a few. So this is an important thing to prepare the Germans for a new tank. As I said, perhaps in many ways the most important thing is the conceptual piece for them. The Soviets wanted to get more out of it. In the end, they didn't. And in 1933, this thing is then closed. Like the other ones I'll talk about in a minute, mainly because of ideological reasons, because you now have the Nazis in power in 1933. They don't really want to work at this stage together with the Soviets. There's also another reason. I can throw it in now. I'm jumping about a little bit, but then you know what I'm talking about before I return to the other two sites that they use. And the other bit that's important in this context here is the Geneva Disarmament Conference, which lasted from 1932 to 1934. In Geneva, everyone gets together. We need to talk about disarmament. Germany is invited. After a while, Germany gets utterly frustrated. That is even before Hitler comes to power, because the Germans say, you're talking about disarmament, no one is disarming, so we are the weakest power in Europe, what the heck is going on here? Which in the end then is the argument to the German government, in the end under Hitler, to say, you know what, we're not having any of this, we are pulling out, and by the way, if you're not disarming, we are rearming. So you could see that by the standards of the day, it kind of all made sense, if that's the right way of putting it. Also in the eyes of the international community. This is also one of the reasons why the Versailles Treaty at that stage was already, you might say, pretty dead. But let's return to the other bits and bobs that the Germans have. Before I forget, so normally the idea was at the tank school that you would send people on 2-year courses, so up to 2 years, so quite long. And of course, I already said you also have the cooperation with industry, so Rheinmetall, Krupp, Daimler, the famous German motor vehicle builders, you might say, were involved in this. You then have the second bit, which is very, very famous, and that is the Petsk fighter schools, so fighter pilots. So Kampffliegerschule in German, which is actually not fighter, but Kampfflieger means something slightly different, but that's now semantics. And there they do basically the same thing, and they train the Air Force and planes. It's a relatively, you might perhaps say, it's a relatively small one. It operates from 1926 to 1933. It's ready for operation in June 1925, but the first course really starts in 1920 or 26. And the numbers, again, are reasonably small. You're looking at around about 120 flying personnel, about 300 ground personnel, and about 400 to 450, roughly speaking, training staff and admin staff and people like that. So the numbers are relatively small. But the important thing, again, is that this becomes the nucleus for the new German Air Force, the people who are there. So that's the important thing. You also have Soviet personnel there. So it's about 340, so local workers. But also, again, it's this idea about know-how, which the Soviets would like to get their hands on. And of course, because they have to disguise the whole thing, they can't call it officially an Air Force school. So they call it the Wissenschaftliche Versuchs- und Prüfanstalt für Luftfahrzeuge. If that isn't a great word, I don't know. Which literally translates as Scientific Research and Test Institute for Aircraft. That is basically it. And then you have the last site, which they also use, and this is the place in the area of Volsk, and that is the Tomka gas site, gas test site. So again, Treaty of Versailles did not allow the Germans to develop or to possess gas. That, of course, had been used in the First World War. So the Germans are now using this together with these two other ones, and that also runs from 1926 all the way to 1933. And this site was then later on used by the Red Army to continue the research into chemical and NBC weapons. So that's the package, you might say, that you get. And the interesting, important, whatever you want to call it, thing is also that the military, when they started doing this, did not inform the politicians, because the military, they simply do not trust the Germans. They do not trust the politicians. So they say, okay, we're going to do this. We're not going to tell anybody about this. And then they have a problem. And that is in 1926. So in 1926, Seeckt is dismissed because of something else. But it's also the year where his then predecessor, a chap called Heyer, had a very nice big bushy moustache, looks like a bit like a granddad, not like a general. They say, whoopsie, we've got a bit of a problem, because by that stage it's been leaked that the army is doing these things. There's a report in the socialist newspaper. Scheidemann, a German politician, very famous at the end of the First World War, he gives a speech in Parliament where he talks about this. So it's basically out in the open. What do you do? Bit of a problem here. What is it if the politicians suddenly say, what the heck have you been doing here? That's not on, and there are going to be consequences. What really happens, cutting a relatively long story short, the defense minister is a chap called Otto Gessler, together with Haye. Well, they go to the prime minister and they say, well, my dear prime minister, you might have read the papers where stuff is happening in the Soviet Union. This is what is going on. And they basically present everything to the government. Interesting enough, the government now says, you know what, that's a good idea. You've got our support. So they can let this run. That also makes it easier to finance the whole thing. Finances, of course, as you can imagine, is always a problem, and say, yeah, they can crack on. And that, of course, is, at least internally, is an important point, because now it's the first time that they actually got the backing of the government. Political history of the Weimar Republic is extremely complex. It's very, very difficult. I don't want to go there because that would be another 15 episodes at least. Very unstable governments. This whole idea of compromise, political compromise, doesn't really exist at that particular time. So it's a complex and very, very difficult story. One of the reasons why they didn't inform them, of course, they don't trust them anyway, because, well, they are, as they would call them, some of them at least, the socialist November criminals, and there we are. So that, again, was a relatively complex story, cut very, very, very short, because, again, it would take forever. But I think you get the idea. So that means that in 1927, in early 1927, and I think it's the 26th of February, Haye then proposes to form a committee in which the state and the army and the political parties would basically reach agreements on the secret rearmament. The Chancellor Marx at that stage, he says, "Yep, okay, that's brilliant." And then when he leaves and a new chap comes in, a chap called Hermann Müller, he continues with this. So you can see there is continuity here, and that, in inverted commas, works quite well. That also gives the Germans now you might say, at least the intellectual and, to a degree, the monetary basis to start thinking about building up a stronger army. This, again, falls out of the 1923 occupation of the Ruhr. And the army sits down, and they come up with two plans, you might say, and they're called Sommerarbeit und Winterarbeit, so that's summer work and winter work. And they're basically, so Sieg gives these guys in the army the task to think about an army structure that we can have in order to defend Germany against another invasion like in 1923. And Winterarbeit, so winter work, that dealt with the creation of what they called an emergency army. And this is basically an army that is put together with all the men and material that is and are still available within the country. So you can see that this is probably not an awful lot. They still think they would get 18 infantry divisions and 3 cavalry divisions. You can see me looking down. I'm looking actually at my PhD here, because, as I said, there's quite a bit of that in here. And the Truppmann come to the conclusion, well, 21 divisions, which sounds a lot to us today. That's not enough. We will not be able to win a war. And they said we'll not be able to conduct a serious war. That's the term that they use. But it would be only able to solve easy tasks limited in time and space. And then you had, in contrast, if you're given all the means and the state starts really supporting you, and you can equip them, and industry is supporting you, and all these things, then you've got Sommerarbeit, summer work. And this would be much, much stronger. And it would be able to fight at the operation level and to meet the operational demands of the Heeresleitung, it says. They said that they would probably have about 1 million soldiers, would need 1 million soldiers to meet all the manpower demands. That's the field army, the border guards, replacements, and what have you. And that would be 35 infantry divisions and 3 cavalry divisions. These would be able to fight a defensive war. So the Truppmann is quite clear about it and says this is not an army to invade and win a war. This is an army to fight a defensive war, nothing else, and hopefully come out of this war victorious. So again, you can see they are relatively obvious and clear and realistic in what can be and what can't be achieved. They also come with the idea of a Nordheer, so another emergency army of 16 divisions. So it's the first plan minus, you might say. Good thing is they get the backing from the government, so you can have money towards it. But everybody realizes that, of course, within the Versailles Treaty and also the lack of industrial capacity as it is, they wouldn't even be able to build up a 21-division army. So they then reduce it for a time and say, well, probably it's going to be 16. If 21 can't do anything, 16 can't do anything. So again, you can see this indirect realization and admittance that should war break out, Germany will not be able to do anything, to fight victorious or whatever. There are some changes to all of this. They go through different models. They go through links with industry as well. They refine these ideas about conscription. This idea comes in the moment Siegt is sacked. The idea of his professional army is sacked as well. Some thinkers even go the complete opposite direction. There's a very influential and these days famous talk that is given by a chap called Joachim vom Stülpnagel. He's a lieutenant colonel in the Truppenamt, and he talks about the People's War, so the uprising of all the people should the country be invaded. So again, that's already in 1920, that's in 23, so early on. So you can see there are all sorts of different ideas. Siegt says, I don't want any of this, and kills it. It comes back up again, bubbles up the moment Siegt is gone. So there are different ideas. They also come up with very exact numbers about how much money you would have to spend, how many people you need to work in industry, the people that you need in the military forces. But again, there's no point in really going through all of them because we'd be here forever, and they really are what you might say pretty much castles in the sky, I would say. This then really only changes, of course, when Hitler comes to power. I already talked about the Geneva Disarmament Conference, which overlaps with Hitler coming to power. And relatively early on, after they've left the conference, the Germans already begin to rearm. So when Hitler then declares that, it's got all power and might over its military, again, Wehrhoheit is the German term for this, in 1935, and then 1936 they start bringing conscripts back in. By this stage, the army no longer stands at 100,000 men, but somewhere already in the region of 240,000, roughly speaking. So they've already had a gradual increase. Not the explosion, you might say, manpower that we see afterwards. But this is what happens now. So they start, of course, 1,000 men, go to somewhere in the region of 240 by 35, 36. And then, of course, you got conscription, and then the whole thing just explodes. This, of course, now is no longer secret. Because Hitler is saying, mainly because of the injustice of the Versailles Treaty, the inability of the disarmament conference to come to some sort of solution, Germany's now going to rearm. And so they do it out in the open. And of course, they build a very strong army, millions of people they've got now. When you then look at what happens in 1939, how the army is enlarged from this very, very small army, roughly speaking, by a factor of 10. Again, you can argue about the exact figures and the figures they deploy versus the figures that you've got in the home army, all these things. But just for argument's sake, let's go with a figure like this. And then, of course, as you go into the war, the military on the whole then, of course, gets much bigger as well. You've got an air force, the Navy is expanding as well. So all this, of course, is there. And they can do this to a degree because you had the quality of the long-serving officers and men in the Reichswehr. So these guys were actually very good because they're extremely well trained. If you serve 12 years in the ranks, 25 years as an officer, you know what you're doing. And these guys become the nucleus of the new army. If you then multiply by a factor of, let's for argument's say 10, of course you're going to lose quality. And actually the German army that goes to war in 1939 is not the perfect war machine. There are significant shortcomings. Its equipment, the German army equipment in 1939 is not overly impressive. The tanks are awful. They don't have enough guns by comparison. They're relatively small. It's an army that is still very, very heavily reliant on horses rather than motor transport. So all these things that come together. Air Force is slightly different. The Navy is struggling. They don't have enough U-boats, for example. I think 57 they've got when the war breaks out, and only a handful of these can actually go into the Atlantic. So you can see all sorts of issues and problems on the German side. It would have been even worse if they hadn't had the preparation of the military in the interwar period during this time of the secret rearmament, secret preparation. And I always like to stress, and I think I've done it a number of times, when you look at military effectiveness. So there's this term, it's called fighting power. That's a term that is being used today in the military terminology. And I think I've talked about this before, so bear with me for a minute if you've already heard this. So there are basically three aspects to military fighting power. What makes an army good and effective and results in the defeat of an enemy. The first is the physical component. That is the stuff you've got. How many men, how many tanks, how many guns, how many planes. You then have the moral factor. So what makes you fight? If morale collapses, then you're basically gone. And the last one is the conceptual, and this is the doctrine, the way you fight, not why, but the way you want to fight. And this is, I would argue, is where the Germans are extremely good at that particular stage, because they don't have the numbers. Morale is probably there. When someone invades, you fight for the defense of your fatherland. You probably die, but that, in inverted commas, you know what I mean, dear listeners, is okay. Don't get this in the wrong way. So it's the conceptual piece, and this is where they put all their engine. This is the basket they put all their eggs in, and of course you can then use that when you go into World War II. Again, it does not mean that particularly in the early stages and then the second half of the war, all these things go really well. To begin with, the Germans are not experienced, don't have practice. When you look at what goes on in Poland, for example, the German after-action report of the German performance in Poland is absolutely damning. It said this was okay, what we did against a second-rate enemy, and I'm quoting here, like the Polish army, if we'd fought with the same tactics, equipment, training against first-rate enemies like France and Britain, we would have lost the war. It's there in the after-action report. And then, of course, when you go into the later stage of the war, after all the casualties and losses, quality also dwindled. So the high time, I think, probably most people would agree, is between 1940, perhaps 1942, to a large degree, at least from the theoretical underpinning of the interwar period. So I would argue that in many ways, the secret rearmament, the most important bit, is not actually, you might say, necessarily rearming, but it's keeping this intellectual flame alive. In those days, it's relatively easy to produce kit. Once you've identified what you want to have, you just do it. You rearm in that way. You build a stronger army. If you don't know how to use that army, then you have a problem. And of course, there are parallels all over history. Even when you look at what goes on in the world today, that's exactly it. When you've got big armies, but the conceptual component is lacking, then you end up with a bit of a problem. I think this is probably it. I'm looking at the clock, 53 or so minutes we've got at the moment. As I said, I could again fill about 10 episodes, because I personally find this period absolutely fascinating for the reasons I just mentioned a few years. Of course, you don't really have a lot of fighting going on, but it's this intellectual interaction with military problems. You look at the way mainly, of course, officers discussed issues, problems, whether it's tank warfare or whatever it might have been, a very kind of open spirit of discussion. What is the best way? And these discussions were there. When you take tank warfare, there's not a linear movement from the First World War to Blitzkrieg and all these things. Say, Bewegungskrieg, as the Germans would have called it, not Blitzkrieg. There are debates, there are tensions, but it's just this openness that you find in the armed forces at that particularly in Germany, because they knew they had to do this in order to be better the next time a war happens. And everyone kind of believed that another war would happen. And sometimes I think when you look at this, wouldn't it be great if we had the same spirit, the same ethos today? I have actually used a number of documents and produced a number of studies for modern militaries based on the experience of the Reichswehr and their approach to military problems, to thinking, conceptual thought, all that kind of stuff. So you might think, well, you know what, this is all ancient history. Quite often it's a bit more than that. And I think this is also one of the things which makes history so very, very interesting. With this, I'm now really going to leave you. As I said, we're going to have Jesse back because you're probably getting bored of just hearing my voice, and you want to have the interaction, because that, let's face it, is what our podcast is all about. As I said, and if you're a listener, you already know this. If you're not doing so already, why not subscribe to us for the podcast? Or we're now doing YouTube as well, where you can watch these videos that we're producing here. Why not sign up? So you know, if you've listened to us before, what the benefits are. We can interact with you, and you can interact with us in what we call the war room, where, as I said earlier, I also picked up this idea or this request for this particular discussion from, and this is why I could indulge and talk about. I wouldn't even just call it a hobby horse, but as I said, pretty much the topic of my PhD. So it makes the PhD seem all worthwhile. Lots of years being stuck in archives and behind desks typing away in the academic ivory tower. But now it's all made sense because I could share it with you, dear listeners. I leave you with that. And we See you next time. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, a Battle Guide production. To support the creation of future episodes, consider joining our dedicated supporter community, where you can enjoy exclusive benefits and connect with like-minded individuals. For more information, please see the show notes, and if you appreciated this episode, please leave a review on your chosen podcast platform. Thank you for listening.